Imagine walking onto a stage in front of thousands of strangers, every eye already judging you, smirking, whispering, laughing, and knowing they don't believe you belong. Then, for 3 minutes and 22 seconds, the room falls silent. This is Susan Boyle, a woman overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed for decades, who stunned the world with a single audition. But the viral moment was only the beginning. What came after, the struggles, the heartbreak, the triumphs no one saw, was far more extraordinary than the world ever imagined. Stay with me, because this story will change the way you think about talent, resilience, and what it truly takes to rise. Born to sing, Susan Magdalene Boyle was born on April 1st, 1961, in Blackburn, West Lothian, Scotland. She was the youngest of 4 boys and 6 girls, 10 children in a working-class family that had barely enough to get by. Her father, Patrick, was a miner. Her mother, Bridget, worked as a shorthand typist. They lived in a council house, which, for those unfamiliar, is government-subsidized housing in the UK. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't comfortable, but it was home. But Susan's challenges started long before she could even understand them. During her birth, there were complications. Susan was deprived of oxygen, a condition that doctors later said caused mild brain damage. And from that moment forward, her life would be shaped by something she had no control over. As a child, Susan was different. She struggled in school. She couldn't keep up with other kids. She was slower to learn, slower to process, odd and painfully aware that she wasn't like everyone else. And children, as we know, can be unbelievably cruel. They called her Susie Simple. They bullied her relentlessly. They pushed her, teased her, excluded her. She became the target of daily humiliation. The girl everyone decided wasn't worth knowing. At home, things weren't much better. While her parents loved her, the household was chaotic. 10 children in a small council house, money always tight, tension always simmering. And Susan, being the youngest and the most vulnerable, often found herself lost in the noise. But there was one thing, one single thing, that made Susan feel alive. Music. Her mother would play records in the house. Hymns at church filled Susan with a feeling she couldn't quite name. And when she sang, quietly, by herself, and where no one could judge her, something inside her shifted. The world made sense. She wasn't Susie Simple anymore. She was just Susan, and she was extraordinary. But nobody told her that, not for a very, very long time. The doctors had labeled her. The schools had written her off. The kids had decided who she was, and Susan believed them. She believed she was less. She believed she was broken. That belief would follow her for decades. The invisible woman, as Susan grew older, her world didn't open up. It got smaller. She left school with almost nothing. No qualifications, no career prospects, no clear path forward. She tried to find work, but her social difficulties made it nearly impossible. She struggled with conversations. She couldn't navigate the unspoken rules of workplaces and relationships. Every job interview felt like a battlefield she wasn't equipped for. She enrolled in a few community programs. She volunteered at her local church, but mostly she stayed home. And then her father died. Patrick Boyle passed away, and the family that was already stretched thin began to fracture. Susan was devastated. Her father had been one of the few people who made her feel safe, and now he was gone. But there was no time to grieve properly, because her mother Bridget, now aging, needed care. And Susan, unmarried, unemployed, and the only one truly available, became her full-time caretaker. Think about that for a moment. A woman who had never been given the tools to take care of herself was now responsible for someone else's entire existence. She cooked, she cleaned, she managed medications. She sat by her mother's side day after day, night after night, for years. Susan's brothers and sisters had their own lives, their own families, their own problems. And Susan, well, Susan was always there, reliable, invisible, expected. She rarely left the house. She had almost no friends, no romantic relationships, no career, no social life. She was in her 20s, then her 30s, then her 40s, and the world outside her front door might as well have been another planet. She still sang, alone, in her bedroom, in the kitchen while washing dishes, at church on Sundays. But the dream of ever doing anything with that voice? She had buried it so deep she'd almost forgotten it was there. Meanwhile, life kept taking from her. Her siblings grew distant. Relationships within the family became strained. And Susan, the one who had given up everything to care for their mother, found herself more alone than ever. Then, in 2007, Bridget Boyle passed away. Susan was 46 years old. She had spent her entire adult life caring for her mother, and now, for the first time in decades, she was alone in that house. Truly, completely alone. The silence must have been deafening. This is the part of the story where most people would give up, where the weight of everything, the years of isolation, the grief, the loneliness, the feeling of being invisible, would crush whatever was left. But Susan Boyle did something no one expected. She made a promise to her mother. On her deathbed, Bridget had told Susan to do something with her life, to pursue her singing, to stop hiding. And for the first time in her life, Susan decided to listen. I'm misdiagnosed, not broken. Before we get to the audition, before the world ever heard her voice, there's something you need to understand. Something that changes everything about this story. For her entire life, Susan Boyle had been told one thing about herself: brain damage. That was the label. Caused by oxygen deprivation during a complicated delivery in 1961. The doctors told her family that the lack of oxygen had caused lasting intellectual impairment. And from that moment forward, every struggle Susan faced was filtered through those two words. Couldn't keep up in school? Brain damage. Couldn't hold a conversation without stumbling? Brain damage. Couldn't make friends? Hold a job? Understand why the world felt so overwhelming? Brain damage. Her teachers at Our Lady of Lourdes Primary School in Blackburn treated her accordingly, and she was placed in remedial classes. Expectations were kept low. She was hit by teachers, something Susan later spoke about openly. Physically disciplined for not understanding lessons fast enough. Can you imagine? A child struggling to process the world around her, and the adults responsible for her care responded with punishment instead of patience. She carried that label like a stone around her neck for over 50 years. Then, in 2012, everything changed. At the age of 51, after years of being in the public eye, Susan underwent a comprehensive assessment by a specialist, and the results were staggering. She didn't have brain damage. She never had. The diagnosis was Asperger's syndrome, a condition on the autism spectrum characterized by difficulties with social interaction, sensory processing, and nonverbal communication, but absolutely not associated with intellectual deficit. In fact, many people with Asperger's syndrome possess above-average intelligence and extraordinary abilities in specific areas. I like music. I like singing. Like hearing a melody once and carrying it perfectly in her memory for decades. Susan sat with that diagnosis and wept. Not from sadness, from relief. In an interview with The Guardian, she described the moment as liberating. "I always knew it was an unfair label," she said. She talked about how the misdiagnosis had shaped every interaction, every opportunity, every relationship in her life. People had spoken to her slowly, treated her as fragile, assumed she couldn't understand things that she understood perfectly well, and they had confused her social discomfort with intellectual inability, and nobody had ever bothered to look deeper. 51 years. 51 years of being told you're something you're not. Of watching people lower their expectations the moment they hear your history. Of doubting your own mind because everyone around you already has. And yet, and this is what gets me, Susan's talent had been there the entire time. Undiminished, undamaged, waiting. She had sung in her local church choir at Our Lady of Lourdes. She had performed in Edinburgh's Touchstone Theatre in small community shows. She had entered local singing competitions. In 1995, she recorded a track called "Cry Me a River" for a charity CD produced by her singing coach, Fred O'Neill, a man who recognized her gift long before anyone else did. And only 1,000 copies were ever made. But that recording, raw, unpolished, stunning, was proof that Susan Boyle's voice was never a fluke. It had always been extraordinary. Fred O'Neill later said he knew from the first moment she opened her mouth. He knew she was special, but the world wasn't ready to listen yet. Back in 2008, standing in her empty house in Blackburn, after her mother's death, Susan didn't have a diagnosis. She didn't have validation. She didn't have anyone telling her she could do this. All she had was a promise to her mother and a voice that had been waiting 47 years to be heard. So she picked up the phone. She applied to Britain's Got Talent. Season 3. Open auditions. And she walked into that auditorium carrying every single year of pain, silence, and disbelief on her shoulders, ready to set it all down on that stage. What happened next? You already know. But trust me, feeling it unfold is something else entirely. When the world watches the opening notes of "I Dreamed a Dream" from Les Miserables filled the auditorium, and Susan Boyle began to sing, within the first 5 seconds, the entire room transformed. Jaws dropped, eyes widened, the smirks vanished. Amanda Holden's mouth fell open. Simon Cowell's eyebrows shot up. Piers Morgan leaned forward in his seat like he'd been struck. The audience erupted, not in laughter, in awe, in disbelief, in pure, unfiltered joy. People were on their feet before she'd even finished the first verse. Strangers were grabbing each other, tears streaming down their faces. And because that voice was something otherworldly, rich, powerful, achingly beautiful. It carried decades of pain, loneliness, and longing in every single note. It was the sound of a woman who had been waiting her entire life for someone to listen. And finally, the whole world was listening. The clip went viral in a way that nothing had ever gone viral before. Within 9 days, it had been viewed over 100 million times. It became the most watched YouTube video in history at that point. News outlets around the globe covered it. Celebrities talked about it. People who had never watched a talent show in their lives were crying at their desks watching Susan Boyle sing. She didn't win the competition. She came in second. But it didn't matter. She had already won something far bigger. Her debut album, I Dreamed a Dream, became the best-selling debut album in UK chart history. It sold over 3 million copies in its first week in the US alone. She was a global phenomenon. But here's what the headlines didn't tell you. The fame nearly destroyed her. Susan was not equipped for what came next. Remember, This was a woman with undiagnosed Asperger's syndrome, a woman who had spent most of her life in a quiet house in a small Scottish town, a woman who found social interaction overwhelming even on a good day. And suddenly, there were cameras everywhere, reporters outside her house, interview requests from every country, people stopping her on the street, the noise, the crowds, the constant attention. It was sensory overload on a scale most of us can't imagine. Shortly after the final, Susan was admitted to the Priory, a private psychiatric clinic in London. She was emotionally exhausted. She was having breakdowns. The transition from total obscurity to global fame in a matter of weeks had pushed her to the edge. The world had finally seen her gift, but they had no idea the price she was paying for it. The hidden battle. What followed was a decade that would have broken most people 10 times over. On paper, Susan's career was a fairy tale. Her debut album, I Dreamed a Dream, released in November 2009, shattered records. It sold 701,000 copies in the first week in the US alone, making it the biggest opening week for a debut album in over a decade. It hit #1 in over 30 countries. By Christmas, Susan Boyle, the woman people had laughed at just months earlier, was outselling every artist on the planet. She released album after album. The Gift in 2010 debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. Someone to Watch Over Me followed in 2011. She performed for Pope Benedict XVI at Bella Houston Park in Glasgow, in front of over 65,000 people. She sang for the Queen during the Diamond Jubilee celebrations. She appeared on The View, America's Got Talent, The Today Show, and stages across the world. Over her career, she sold more than 25 million records globally and amassed an estimated net worth of over $40 million. But behind the tour buses and television appearances, Susan was unraveling. The Priory stay after Britain's Got Talent was only the beginning. The sensory demands of fame, flashing cameras, loud crowds, constant travel, unfamiliar hotel rooms every night, were excruciating for someone with undiagnosed Asperger's syndrome. She described feeling like she was living in a washing machine. Everything was too fast, too loud, too much. And then there were the people who came out of the woodwork. Family tensions that had simmered for years boiled over. Reports surfaced of disputes over money. Some relatives who had barely been present during Susan's decades of caregiving suddenly had opinions about her finances. There were legal conversations, uncomfortable confrontations. The quiet woman who had spent her life avoiding conflict was now at the center of it. Her brother Jerry became involved in managing aspects of her affairs, and the dynamics within the Boyle family shifted in ways that left scars. Susan, who had always craved connection and belonging, found that fame had made her relationships more complicated, not less. She was honest about loneliness. And in a 2014 interview, she admitted she still lived alone in the same council house in Blackburn where she'd cared for her mother. She hadn't moved to a mansion. She hadn't reinvented herself. She was still Susan. Just Susan with a recording contract and a world that wouldn't stop watching. Then, something unexpected. She spoke publicly about experiencing companionship for the first time. She had found someone, a doctor she'd met in the United States. She was in her 50s, and for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to have someone choose to be beside her. It was quiet, private, and profoundly meaningful. But life wasn't finished testing her. In April 2022, Susan suffered a stroke at her home. She was 61. The news sent shockwaves through her fan base and the music industry. Her team confirmed she was receiving treatment, but details were scarce. For months, silence. No performances, no public appearances, just recovery, slow and uncertain. Doctors weren't sure the voice would come back. Susan wasn't sure either. But in September 2023, she walked back onto the America's Got Talent stage for the show's results finale. She was visibly thinner. Her movements were careful. But when she sang, that unmistakable voice, weathered now, yes, but still carrying that deep, aching beauty, filled the room. The audience stood. The judges wept. Simon Cowell, the man who had once raised an eyebrow at her, looked at her with something that could only be described as reverence. Susan Boyle had done it again, against every odd, through every setback. She stood up and she sang. And yet, for all the applause and the headlines, the story isn't over. What happens when the world thinks it knows you, and you prove them wrong? How far can one person's courage ripple through a life built on doubt, disappointment, and overlooked potential? Susan stood alone on that stage. But what happens when the spotlight fades, the audience leaves, and the real challenges begin? That's the question we'll follow next. And the answer might be more extraordinary than anything you expect.